Behind the holy robes, darkness festered. One night, Ruth, a young choir member, returned to church to retrieve her forgotten phone. As she crept into the pastor's office, she froze. Through the half-open door, she saw Pastor Emmanuel counting bundles of foreign currency. Beside him sat a man in a black suit, handing over a brown envelope. On the table were strange documents, land deeds, death certificates, and forged signatures. Sit tight and enjoy this powerful and interesting story. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Gracefield City woke each morning to the sun's rays catching on the towering white walls of the Fountain of Light Ministry. It was more than a church. It was a landmark, a monument of marble and glass that shone like a beacon to the faithful. People spoke of it with pride, as if the building itself breathed God's presence. But beneath that shining beauty, unseen cracks spread through its foundation. The smiles at the gate hid silent sorrows. The echo of hymns sometimes carried a hollow note, like the faint ringing of a bell after a funeral. Few noticed. Fewer cared. At the heart of the ministry was Pastor Emmanuel Dike, a man whose presence could still a restless crowd. He carried himself with the confidence of a general returning from war, and the congregation adored him for it. His voice rolled through the sanctuary like thunder, shaking hearts, stirring tears, igniting hope. Mothers pointed him out to their children as a living example of holiness. But somewhere in his eyes, if one looked closely enough, there was a flicker, not of divine fire, but of possession, like a man guarding a secret vault no one must open. Under Pastor Emmanuel's watch, the church became a kingdom built on offerings. Families donated cars, land, and more money than they could afford. Widows gave their last coins, and struggling parents skipped meals to sow seeds into what they believed was sacred ground. And as they gave, the church expanded. Adding gold-trimmed doors, imported marble floors, and crystal chandeliers that made the light dance. The congregation saw prosperity as proof of God's blessing. Yet in the shadows of this kingdom, the poor grew poorer, their prayers rising like incense in a room where someone had quietly shut the windows. One funeral in particular clung to Gracefield's memory like a stubborn shadow. The service was grand, the casket draped in white silk, the air heavy with the scent of roses. Pastor Emmanuel spoke of victory over death, of crowns in heaven. Yet, the family's grief seemed sharper, more bitter. They avoided his gaze, their mourning not just for a loved one, but for something else lost, something they dared not speak. In that moment, the air felt thick with unspoken truths. Those who noticed brushed it aside. It was easier to believe in miracles than to question the hand that blessed them. It was late one rainy evening when Ruth, a young choir member, realized she had left her phone behind after rehearsal. The streets glistened under the streetlights as she hurried back. The church loomed ahead, silent, almost watchful. Inside, the air was still. Her footsteps echoed down the corridor until she reached the pastor's office. The door stood slightly ajar, light spilling out in a thin, accusing line. She moved closer, heart drumming. What she saw through that narrow gap would change her life forever, setting fire to the foundations of everything she believed. In the pastor's office, the holy man sat not with a Bible, but with bundles of foreign currency stacked like bricks of a hidden fortress. Beside him, a man in a black suit handed over a brown envelope. On the table lay documents, land deeds, death certificates, and signatures that seemed too perfect to be real. Each paper felt like a nail in someone's coffin. Ruth's breath caught. The weight of the truth pressed on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She stepped back into the shadows, afraid that even the air might betray her hiding place. Sleep abandoned Ruth in the nights that followed. The image of those documents burned into her mind, reappearing every time she closed her eyes. She began to see the pastor differently, not as a shepherd, but as a predator cloaked in light. Every sermon, every prayer now felt like a performance, a carefully staged act to keep the congregation blind. She questioned every healing testimony, every funeral blessing. The seed of doubt had been planted deep, and it grew quickly, twisting her faith into something cold and heavy. Ruth started to notice patterns, faces in the pews that vanished after a short illness, always followed by the same hushed funerals and sudden transfers of property to the church. The wealthy and sick seemed to disappear fastest. It was as if there was an invisible list, and once a name appeared on it, the end came swiftly. People thought the hospital visits were mercy. Ruth began to see them as summons to death. Each time she saw the pastor's hand on a shoulder, she wondered if it was a blessing or the mark of doom. The church-owned hospital stood as a symbol of care and compassion, but its walls told a different story. Ruth visited under the pretense of delivering choir flowers to a sick member. The rooms were spotless, almost too clean, like a showroom where death was politely hidden. Nurses moved with mechanical precision, their eyes darting away from hers. The patient she saw looked less like they were healing and more like they were waiting, drained, pale, resigned. Ruth felt the weight of unseen eyes following her every step, as though the hospital itself was warning her not to linger too long. During Sunday service, Ruth stood among the choir, her voice steady but her mind racing. She could feel the suspicion growing among a few others, trusted friends to whom she had quietly spoken. Their smiles during hymns were tighter now, their glances sharper. The once joyful sound of worship seemed to carry a note of mourning, as though the angels themselves had grown weary of pretending. The air in the sanctuary was different. The light still streamed through the stained glass, but it no longer felt warm. It felt like the watchful glow of an eye that missed nothing. Another funeral came, a wealthy woman beloved in the church. The service was lavish, with white doves released into the air and a casket that shimmered under the lights. The pastor's words flowed like honey, promising crowns and glory. But Ruth's eyes stayed fixed on the grieving family, who seemed more defeated than sorrowful. When the service ended, whispers circulated about the woman's estate, how it had already been transferred to the ministry. The gold-trimmed coffin now seemed like an insult, as though the dead had been wrapped in the very wealth taken from them. It was the journalist's turn to step into the story. Under the cover of night, small black cameras were hidden in the pastor's office. The lens waited patiently, capturing each unguarded moment. Weeks passed, and with them came a gallery of evidence. The pastor's hands signing away property, his smile widening as he counted cash, his eyes gleaming when death certificates slid across the table. The cameras saw what no one dared to witness in person. They became the silent witnesses to the decay of a man once called holy. The footage revealed something more than greed. It showed transformation. The moment the congregation left, the gentle pastor shed his public skin like a snake. His shoulders loosened, his smile sharpened, his laughter deepened into something colder. He did not just take from the dead, he planned their deaths. The documents were not accidents. They were blueprints for theft. Watching the footage was like watching light rot into darkness, the holy robes turning to shadows before one's eyes. The evidence was now undeniable. The journalist prepared the final cut, a series of images and recordings that would shatter the church's facade. Outside, Gracefield went about its business, unaware that a storm had already gathered above their shining tower. The city would not see it coming. The congregation would not have time to brace. And when the first drop fell, it would not be rain. It would be the truth, sharp enough to slice through faith itself. It began with a headline. Gracefield City awoke to newspapers and phone screens screaming of betrayal. The footage played on every channel, grainy yet damning. The holy man, the beloved shepherd, was shown counting bribes, sealing deals with death certificates. Homes and lands changed hands in shadowed rooms. The city held its breath as the image of Pastor Emmanuel, once draped in light, now stood stripped bare. Shock surged through living rooms, markets, and offices. The church bells that morning rang not with joy but with the heavy toll of shame. The wolf had stepped into daylight, and no one could look away. The internet devoured the story. Videos spread like wildfire across messaging apps, hashtags rising like smoke signals from every corner of the country. Memes mocked the pastor's once sacred image, transforming his smiling face into a mask of greed. Voice notes poured out, some defending, most condemning. Even the faithful could not ignore the damning clarity of the recordings. Screens glowed late into the night as people replayed each second, dissecting every movement, every smirk. Gracefield was burning, not in flames, but in trust, in faith, in the fragile thread that had bound a community together under one man's voice. Sunday came, and the church gates remained shut. The golden signboard above the entrance hung askew, its screws loosened as though it too had lost the will to stand. No choir songs floated into the morning air. No worshippers gathered on the marble steps. The grand pulpit sat in darkness, its polished surface collecting dust. Rows of empty seats stared at the altar like abandoned witnesses to a crime. The silence inside was so thick that even the ticking of the clock sounded like a gavel. A place once filled with praise now echoed only with the weight of disgrace. Former members walked the streets with eyes lowered, avoiding the stares of neighbors. They had knelt at that altar, poured their savings into that ministry, defended that man with fervent conviction. Now, every memory felt like a wound. Mothers remembered the coins they had pressed into offering baskets while their children went hungry. Widows recalled giving up land that had been in their families for generations. The betrayal was not just financial. It was spiritual, emotional, almost physical in its heaviness. The man they trusted with their souls had traded those souls for gold, and they were left hollowed. One by one, the widows stepped forward. Their voices shook as they recounted how their husbands' deaths had been followed by the quiet arrival of church officials with papers to sign. They told of prayers that came with conditions, of hospital stays that ended abruptly, of grief compounded by loss of home. Their testimonies painted a tapestry of cruelty, each thread a life stripped bare. The city listened in stunned silence. These were not the murmurs of the bitter, they were the raw cries of the broken, finally unearthing the truth from beneath the rubble of their faith. The hospital, once hailed as the church's crown jewel, became a place of dread. Journalists wandered its sterile halls, their cameras catching the cold gleam of metal beds, the sharp scent of antiseptic lingering like guilt. Empty rooms held the faint hum of abandoned machines. Some doors were locked, their contents unknown. Former patients came forward, speaking of whispered instructions between nurses, of treatments that seemed to drain rather than heal. The building stood tall, but its walls felt damp with secrets. It was no sanctuary of healing. It was a quiet graveyard wearing the mask of mercy. The journalist's exposé aired in full, an unflinching hour of evidence, testimonies, and a timeline of exploitation. It laid bare how Pastor Emmanuel had built his empire not on miracles but on manipulation, coercion, and calculated cruelty. The broadcast stripped away any remaining illusions, showing the machinery behind the mask. There were no accidents, no coincidences, only a predatory system designed to consume the vulnerable. The public's outrage hardened into something heavier, a determination to dismantle every brick of the kingdom he had built. The wolf's den had been mapped for all to see, and the hunt had begun. Clips from his old sermons resurfaced, replayed not as inspiration but as evidence. Words once celebrated now dripped with irony, sounding less like prophecy and more like confession. Viewers leaned closer, hearing in his pauses the calculations, in his emphasis the hidden demands. The charisma that had once bound people now unsettled them, each smile reframed as a predator's grin. His sermons had been the soundtrack to their devotion. Now they were the background music to their shame. It was as if the city had been under a spell, and the recordings were the bitter cure that left them cold. The day came when the church's signboard was torn down. The act was both deliberate and symbolic. Men climbed ladders and unbolted the golden letters, letting them fall one by one onto the cracked pavement. The sound of metal hitting stone echoed like distant gunfire. Onlookers watched in silence, some with tears, others with grim satisfaction. Where once the name shone with pride, there was now only a blank space, an open wound on the building's face. The wind moved through the emptiness as if testing the church's hollow chest, finding no heartbeat within. The city moved through its days in a kind of spiritual mourning. People stopped attending other churches, wary of stepping into another trap. Pastors in neighboring congregations preached to half-empty pews, their words falling into pools of suspicion. The market women gossiped less about politics and more about who could still be trusted in matters of faith. Even weddings and christenings felt subdued, stripped of the once shared joy. Gracefield had not just lost a church, it had lost its innocence, and no one knew how long it would take for trust to be rebuilt. Pastor Emmanuel's family scattered, their homes sold off to cover legal fees. Former allies who had once basked in his light now avoided his name, fearing it would scorch them. The properties acquired through his schemes were seized, their wealth redistributed in fragments too small to heal the damage. His name became a curse, muttered only as a warning to others. What had been built over decades crumbled in months, leaving nothing but the bitter taste of regret in those who had helped him rise. The empire had collapsed, but its shadow still darkened the city. The church building, stripped of its grandeur, stood abandoned. Vines crept along the once gleaming walls, weaving themselves through cracks in the marble. Inside, dust settled on the altar where countless offerings had been laid. The air smelled of damp wood and silence. On stormy nights, locals claimed to hear faint echoes of hymns, as if the walls themselves remembered the voices that once filled them. It stood as a monument to misplaced faith, a warning carved in stone. The final offering was not of gold or land. It was the lesson Gracefield paid for in trust it could never reclaim.